Welcome back, everybody. I hope the stay-at-home orders are treating you all well. Let me just start today once again with my disclaimer about what I'm doing here. I'm a historian. I'm an American historian who specializes in politics and economics. I'm a college professor. I do not speak for my employer when I do these live chats. And I will answer questions that you've sent to me to the best of my ability with all my experience in doing political and economic history. But that being said, I will make mistakes. I'm going to correct a mistake that I made last night, by the way, in my letter, which I'll also do tonight in tonight's letter. I am open to corrections, and I will publish them as they seem to be relevant to whatever it is I'm doing. But I would ask you just to remember that I am one person. I don't have a staff. The people in larger media do have staffs, and so when I do screw up, just have patience with me. I'm doing the best I can here, and trying to do a lot of stuff as well. I do have a full-time job as well as doing this politics and history stuff on Facebook and on my newsletter. So what I want to start with today is some of the questions that people have asked. And that will, of course, involve the correction that I just suggested I'd made. And I have, once again, 4, I think, questions that I wanted to deal with today. And the first one that everybody is asking about is, of course, Wisconsin. And I wrote about Wisconsin at length last night, and that's where I wanted to make a correction. I said that Judge Kelly was up for re-election today. That was incorrect. Judge Kelly was appointed by Republican Governor Scott Walker. I was getting confused with Rick Scott. Scott Walker. So he is not up for re-election. He was an appointee who recused himself in the voter purge case and now is waiting to see whether or not he will actually be elected by the people to hold that position. So I made a mistake on that. And that's actually a really great example of how I work. The reason that went up so late last night, it went up after 4 o'clock, is because that story is not new. I've written about pieces of that before in my posts and in the newsletter, but it was scattered over so much media. Nailing that together into a coherent story took hours and hours and hours. Critical point that Walker was not, that Judge Kelly had not been elected by the people. He had been appointed by Scott Walker, Republican governor. All right, so people have asked about Wisconsin, and I want to talk about disfranchisement. People seem very distressed about what's happening in Wisconsin, and they should be. But that being said, is disfranchisement a new thing in American history? And the answer to that is absolutely not. American voting, it's worth remembering, is run at a state level. It's not run at a federal level, and I want to talk a bit about that in a minute. But because it's written at a state level, what that means is there are a number of ways in which it's possible to fiddle around with who gets to vote, to see whether or not your party can win over the other party, simply by adjusting who gets the vote. And what this always, always, always translates to is either disfranchisement, making sure that some people that you think won't support the party can't vote, or the expansion of voting. At times we've had dramatic expansion of voting because somebody looks at the electorate and says, man, if we can just get the women to vote, or if we can just get 18-year-olds to vote, then I'm going to win. And so at times we have quite dramatic voter expansion in order to manipulate who's going to win an election. And that's a really important thing because right now the GOP has constricted the vote really hugely. So once that dam breaks and a number of the people who have been disfranchised since 1981 start to vote again, the GOP is looking at a really long period in the political wilderness, and they know it, which is why they're fighting so hard right now. And that's, again, right now I'm talking about the Republican Party. There have been times when it was the same thing was true of the Democratic Party, and let me tell you about that. All right, so is it new? No. And the first case that I can point to about voter disfranchisement is all the way back in 1800. Women lose the vote in the early 1800s in the state of New Jersey when it becomes clear that they're not going to be supporting Thomas Jefferson's party for president. So it goes all the way back to 1800. Really dramatically, though, we're going to see disfranchisement in the 1850s, and I'm going to tell you more about that in a minute. And something really crucial happens in the 1860s. It's going to inform the rest of American the process of American disfranchisement after the Civil War, and we're still living with what happened then in the 1860s. And what happened then is a new kind of equation of what the proper relationship is between an individual and the federal government. And that happens in the 1860s because of this. During the Civil War, the Republican Party does a number of things, of course. It fights a war, among other things, but it does two major things that are going to matter for voting from then on. First of all, it creates our first national system of taxation. It creates both what they call manufacturing taxes, which for our purposes today consider sales taxes. Basically, they cover everything and everybody. And it invents our first income taxes, our first national income taxes. Now, until the Civil War, taxation had been done solely at the state level, even during the War of 1812. But during the Civil War, taxation becomes national. And when taxation becomes national, and it includes income taxes, including a national system of collecting those income taxes, what is going to become our IRS, when that happens, how people vote and who gets to vote has a direct relationship to people's pocketbooks, to how much money is going to go into the federal government. And that's one thing the Republican Party does during the Civil War. But the other thing that the Republican Party does during the Civil War, or after the Civil War, is that it ends human enslavement, except in cases of conviction of crime, which I always make a big deal of because it is a big deal much later on. But for our purposes today, it gets rid of Black enslavement, except for that quite large loophole. And in 1868, it says that citizenship belongs to anybody who has been born in the United States, and there's going to be caveats to that in a minute. And then dramatically, with the 15th Amendment in 1870, the Republican Party first writes the amendment, and then states ratify it. With the 15th Amendment, Republicans say that African American men have the right to vote. So in the space of about 5 years, a little bit more than that, America has gone from not having national taxation to having quite large national taxation, and to saying that now Black men can vote. And with that construction, with the idea that you're going to have impoverished, because it's been against the law for enslaved African Americans to own property, and very difficult for African Americans in other states who are not enslaved to do that. So impoverished people, uneducated people, because it was a crime to let or to permit or to enable African Americans to learn to read, for example. You're going to have uneducated, propertyless men, Black men, voting. And almost immediately, people who object to the rights of African Americans in American society at all, but certainly in terms of voting, begin to say, if you let Black people vote, they are going to vote for programs that are going to cost tax dollars. And when they vote for those programs that cost tax dollars, the only people in the South anyway who have money to pay for those taxes are white people. So letting Black people vote by 1871, shortly after the 15th Amendment, in the South, Southern Democrats begin to say that by letting Black people vote, you are permitting them to redistribute wealth from white people. That is, Black voting is going to take tax dollars from hardworking white people. It is therefore a redistribution of wealth, and it is socialism. That's when we get the American obsession with socialism, and by mid-1871 with communism. And that comes from the idea of the Paris Commune, which takes over the city of Paris in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War from March through May of 1871. And in that Paris Commune, the communards, as they are known, are represented in American media as workers who've taken over the government. And this makes a huge splash in America, not least because it's news coming over the brand new transatlantic cable. It becomes headline news across America in 1871, the idea of the Paris Commune. And Americans begin to say that if you let lower class people vote, especially people of color, although at that point they're really only talking about African Americans, that's going to expand, of course. What you're doing is you're welcoming socialism or communism into America. and I hope a lot of you guys are sitting down because that should sound really familiar. That comes right out of 1871 and right out of Reconstruction. So what happens then is you go from the idea in 1868, that anybody born in America, and it's not clear that's not going to include women, by the way. You're not going to get the word male in the 14th Amendment. You're going to get the word male in the 15th, but not in the 14th. The idea that being born in America makes you a citizen is coupled with the idea that citizenship should give you the right to vote. By 1873-74, as Americans are beginning to worry about the idea of having poor people vote, that not only sweeps in Black Americans, it also sweeps in immigrants. And Americans, especially in the North, are not terribly concerned about Black voting yet because we haven't had the great migrations of the 20th century. But they're very, very concerned about immigrants voting because immigrants, especially in New York City, tend to vote for Democrats, not for Republicans. So by 1873, 1874, white middle-class Americans are beginning to worry about lower-class people voting, Black or immigrant lower-class voting, because they're afraid it's going to take their tax dollars. It's going to create socialism or communism in America. What happens then is that women start to decide that, come on, we're citizens under the 14th Amendment. We were born in America. Therefore, as citizens, we should have the right to vote. And in 1872, women in America hold what's called a vote-in. They literally show up to vote. And this is why Susan B. Anthony gets so famous for her speeches about the odious aristocracy of sex, because she votes in Rochester, New York, and is later arrested, tried, and convicted of the crime of voting. That's why she has such a big mouthpiece in the 1870s about woman suffrage. But a more important case for me today is what happens out in Missouri, because what happens in Missouri is that a woman named Virginia Minor tries to register to vote. And the registrar, Reese Happersett, will not let her vote because she's a woman. She sues him, and the case of Minor v. Happersett goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court takes on Minor v. Happersett, and it issues an opinion in 1875. The citations you see for 1874 are referring to the year that the term of court. And this matters actually in just a minute. The decision itself is handed down in 1875. And what Minor v. Happersett says is it goes on at great, I'm sorry, all you lawyers out there, boring length of how, of course, women are citizens. That women, and I'm going to be really hyperbolic here, but it's like they take a look at everything every woman has ever done in America and they write it down and they say, see, she's a citizen. See, she's a citizen. She's a citizen. But it goes through all this. And then it has this kicker at the end of the decision where it says, yes, of course, women are citizens. But citizenship does not necessarily mean the right to vote. And that's why the date 1875 is so important, because you know what happens in 1876 with the divorce of citizenship from voting made explicit by the Supreme Court. In 1876, Southern Democrats keep African Americans from voting in the South, and they're going to start the purge of Black voters in the South, which is going to continue throughout the 19th century and really become complete in the early 20th, and last, as you all know, until the 1960s, and I'll talk more about that in a second. So throughout the late 19th century, after Minor v. Happersett, different people in control of different states try to prevent those they don't like from voting. And because of the structure of society and the fact that by the 1880s, really, the government is in the hands of the rising wealthy, the people they turn against are people they call communists or socialists. And I know that's going to sound really funny to a lot of people, but if you want to do a search of the New York Times, for example, in the 19th century, which you can often do through your local library, you'll be shocked at how often the word socialism comes up, beginning in 1871, beginning about in May of 1871, actually. And similarly with the word communism, they're very, very, very concerned about these things, and they turn it against the idea of universal voting. What they say is that we must purge society of these communist or socialist voters. And you see this again and again, but in the 19th century. Obviously, in the South, you really don't have a democracy any longer. You have lost African-American male voting altogether. And of course, Black women couldn't vote anyway. We don't get the amendment letting people women vote until 1920. But you also get an attempt to purge immigrant voters from the North. So in 1888, for example, the election of 1888, when the Republicans have lost the election of 84 and they're convinced that they're in trouble for losing it in 88, and if they do, they're afraid that, as they say, communists or socialists will take over. Literally, in the election of 1888, there is a big push to prevent immigrants from voting, but also to prevent workers from voting. So employers would actually warn their employees, if you vote for a Democrat, you don't expect to show up to work after the election. And employers would know, because as I said last week, you voted by a ticket in this era. And a ticket was, it was probably 3 inches by 6 inches or 2. I'm bad at sizes, but it's small, but it's big enough that employers could see how you were voting, and they were color coded. So you couldn't really have a secret ballot. You had to do whatever you were told, and you would take this ballot and you would put it in the box, and everybody would see how you had voted. Well, after this, and the real dislike of the corruption involved in that kind of a system where everybody knows who is voting how, we get our first major ballot reform. And I'm mentioning this because it's really important for where we are today. We take our cues at the time from Australia, and we adopt what's known as the Australian ballot. It's known as the Australian ballot because that's where they're doing it, of course, but it does 2 important things. First of all, political parties stop being the ones responsible for writing the ballots. It goes to a state organization that does it on a nonpartisan basis. It also puts these 2 tickets together so that you have to be able to read in order to tell for whom you're voting. So no longer can you vote, really, if you're illiterate. So it has the advantage of cutting employers and peer pressure, if you will, out of voting, which is one way to reform it. It also cuts out of voting the poor, who tend to be illiterate, and that tends to be immigrant workers who can't read English. So the Australian ballot is this kind of double-edged reform. It tries to clean up the ballot. It tries to get money out of politics by not enabling employers to see how their workers are voting. But it also means you have to be able to read in order to vote. And the letters about the Australian ballot, just for completely, well, not bizarre reasons, but when I was writing the Wounded Knee book, I had to read through the Benjamin Harrison papers, who was president during this. And it's actually fascinating. The different parties have these schools at night where they're trying to teach their supporters to read. And the Republicans argue it publicly that they're going to be the one, the Republicans are the clean guys, and they're the ones who are cleaning things up, and they're going to stop the Democrats from voting. But the reality is their private letters are like, oh crap, we hope we can teach more people to read faster than the Democrats can teach people to read, because we're not at all sure this is going to work. And in fact, after the Australian ballot first goes into use in 1890, and the Republicans take a shellacking in the election of that year, the letters back and forth amongst the leaders of the Republican Party are like, crap, what is wrong with our voters? None of them can seem to figure out how to fill out a ballot. Anyway, it's kind of fun reading. But on the heels of that, we get new constitutions in the 1890s based off of a constitution that Mississippi wrote, known, stunningly enough, as the Mississippi Constitution of 1890. That constitution codifies into the state bedrock law a series of disfranchisement policies that managed to wipe out black voting until the 1960s. And those are things like a grandfather clause. It didn't matter who you were so long as your grandfather had voted. Well, if you're a black man in Mississippi, your grandfather was enslaved. He wasn't voting. So there goes anybody who had an enslaved history. There were things like you had to be able to interpret the Constitution to the satisfaction of the registrar. Well, it depends on who the registrar is. You can see an African-American who was a highly trained lawyer not being able to convince a guy with a 5th grade education and him saying, no, sorry, no good, no can do. You are not interpreting this correctly. So there were all sorts of things put into the Constitution that made it so African Americans could not vote. But every other state in the Union, with the exception of Massachusetts, went ahead and rewrote their own state constitutions in the 1890s, making similar constrictions on the vote. Obviously, other states were not so concerned about black voting, but they were concerned about workers voting. So in the 1890s, you get this restriction of voting in general across the state constitutions. And that's a really interesting thing, because One of the reasons we get the progressive era is because once you have gotten rid of all of the people that the wealthier Americans were calling communists and socialists, there was really no good argument for not cleaning up society. And one of the reasons we get the progressive era is because leaders are not able to demagogue it. They can't say that cleaning up the cities is you're cleaning up the cities because of the way immigrants are voting when the immigrants aren't voting. And you can't say that we have to clean up workers' regulations and the regulation of business when in fact workers aren't having a say in it. So in this really weirdly paradoxical way, we get the progressive era, in part because it's such a horrible era for people of color and for workers. So what happens after that is, and where we are in the present, and I'll try and speed this up a little bit, is with the disfranchisement that's happening in the teens and the 20s and into the 30s, the voting gets quite restricted. And after World War II, there's a huge attempt to change the voices that are welcome in American society, because World War II is such a widespread effort to try and save American democracy that when it's over, the people who participated in that war, Latinos, African Americans, Indian Americans, or American Indians, and women start to clamor for their own right to have a say in American society. And I've talked about this in the past. First FDR to some degree, and then Truman, and later Eisenhower, all want to expand the suffrage, especially to men. Women are voting after 1920, of course, but they tend to vote like their husbands. They want to expand the voting because of the propaganda, both because they believe it's right, but also because it offers such extraordinary propaganda to communist China and to the USSR to be able to say, forget about that democracy stuff. Americans talk a lot, but look how they treat Black people. And presidents are very aware of that, so they do want to expand voting. And they're pressured by people, and I want to throw some names out here, people like Hector Garcia, who really starts working with the American GI Forum to enfranchise the Hispanic soldiers of World War II, who came home and discovered they really should have a place in American society, and they didn't. He tried to expand the vote there. Of course, African Americans are trying to get the vote. Indian Americans, I keep saying that, American Indians are also trying to expand their access to the vote, especially into the 1950s and 1960s. And later, women are going to ask for more suffrage rights than they had had. In 1954, with the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education, that enables people who are afraid of these lower class or underprivileged voters from having a say in American society to be able to leverage that argument from Reconstruction to say, if you let Black people vote, and of course African Americans are disproportionately poor in this era, as are Latinos, if you let those people vote, they're going to vote for policies that are going to cost tax dollars. So essentially, letting Black people, Latinos, American Indians, Chinese people vote, what you're doing is you're allowing, as they say, socialism or communism to snake its way into America. And that old idea from Reconstruction rears its head again. The idea that permitting everyone to vote welcomes communism into America. You see this obviously throughout American society today, when you see Mitt Romney, for example, talking about the makers versus the takers, the idea that there are people who are on the dole, people who are simply taking handouts, that Americans shouldn't provide stuff, free stuff, as a lot of Republicans say, to Democrats, to the idea that Democrats want to expand voting solely because they want to give stuff to their voters. You saw it with the debate over the coronavirus, the third coronavirus package, the idea that Democrats were stuffing things in there as giveaways. All of that is that language that comes straight out of Reconstruction, that if you expand the vote, you are permitting socialism or communism to come into America. And conversely, the best thing to do if you're a good American is to make sure those people can't vote. So the idea of constricting the vote to make sure, first of all, that people of color can't vote, then feminist women can't vote because they too are looking for policy, special interest legislation, if you will, that will cost tax dollars. And finally, the idea that to which we've gotten under Trump, that you shouldn't let Democrats vote because Democrats are the ones who are pushing this socialism. All of that comes straight out of Reconstruction and really is one of the things that is pushing so dramatically voter restriction today. So what happens is that in 1965, under LBJ, Congress passes the Voting Rights Act, which says that before any state can constrict the vote or can change the voting laws, it has to be approved by the Department of Justice. That is overturned by the Supreme Court in Shelby v. Holder in 2013. And as soon as Shelby v. Holder comes down, the decision is handed down, a number of states immediately, as in within hours, begin to introduce voter ID laws. And the voter ID laws, you hear this meme again and again and again. It's very hot right now in the last 2 days in social media saying, what do Democrats have against voter ID? Well, what Democrats have against voter ID, and I'm not speaking as a Democrat, I'm telling you about this historically, is that the idea of a national ID is actually something that Democrats historically have liked. It's been Republicans who didn't like that because they thought it was government overreach. But a national ID, even a national picture ID, is quite fine with a lot of Democrats. The problem is that voter ID is not constructed that way. Voter ID is set up in such a way that it privileges certain populations. So, for example, if you say that one of the only ways you can have an ID and vote in your state is to have a driver's license, well, that's going to discriminate against people who don't have cars. Well, okay, you say, well, fine. Why don't they just go? They can get themselves to the DMV or DMV and get a license, even if they're not going to drive. Well, that seems like a good idea, but that happened, for example, in Georgia. And what Georgia did promptly is it closed all the places you could register to vote in predominantly black counties. So now you not only have to get to it, it's no longer easy to get to. And there are all sorts of ways that you can manipulate voter IDs to make sure only certain populations vote. Another one I really like is in Texas for a while. I don't know if it's still true. Your name when you voted, had to match exactly your name on your ID. Well, what was at stake in that election was that there was a very popular woman who was running for office, and women liked her very much. If you think about whose names change as adults, it's women. So, it was actually quite expensive to get a new license. So when that happened, what it meant was a lot of women couldn't vote. So that's the problem with voter ID. And that's when when this whole ID issue really came to the fore, is after the gutting rights, the idea of protection of voting rights in the Voting Rights Act of 65 was gutted by Shelby v. Holder in 2013. Now, people have asked again and again, like, what can we do? Here's a number of things you can do if you don't like this. First of all, there is afoot in Congress and the Senate right now a move to start mail-in ballots, to say that to demand that everybody, at least during the coronavirus, can vote by mail. And this needs really to be pushed. Because rather than it simply happening, because again, right now we have a system by which states determine our voting system, and this would be a national mandate, and a national mandate is going to change the foundation of our voting. It's also going to be expensive, which is why the Democrats wanted to put in the last coronavirus bill $4 billion to make this switch, and the Republicans cut that to $400 million, and that's when Trump said, they put all this crazy stuff in that bill. If they get it, another Republican will never be elected. And he's right. This would be a huge difference in terms of the balance of the parties. The other idea that somebody has thrown out, a number of people have thrown out, and most notably by Norm Ornstein and E.J. Dionne in a book they wrote together a few years ago. And Norm is from the American Enterprise Institute, and E.J. Ornstein works for the American Enterprise Institute, which is a right-leaning institution, and Dionne works for the Washington Post. And they made a case for mandatory voting. And I have always been against, or had always been against, mandatory voting, because it seems to me that not voting is as much a decision as voting is, and I thought people should have that right. And I made that case, and they convinced me otherwise, because they said something really important. And they said, right now, it is in the interests of the state, the people in charge of a state, to keep people from the polls. So if you're a Democrat running the state of Maryland, for example, it's in your interest not to get Republicans to the polls. So you're going to do everything you can to get Democrats there and not Republicans. Or similarly in Wisconsin, obviously, it's in the interest of the state to get Republicans to the polls and not Democrats. So, right now, the state has an interest in not getting people to vote. But if you made it mandatory, the state interest would suddenly flip. Suddenly, the state would have an interest in getting people to vote. So the regions of Ohio, for example, that in the past have trouble getting voting machines, suddenly they would be priorities because the state would need to get those people through the system faster. So it changes the pressure on the state. And once they said that, I was like, oh my, I never thought of that. And I became a convert to the idea of mandatory voting, which, to bring us full circle, has been pioneered by Australia and works fine there. So, so that's what's happening with the history of voter disfranchisement. All right. So next question was about gerrymandering. Could I explain gerrymandering? Yes. And gerrymandering, also, like voter suppression, has a long history in America. The trick to gerrymandering is essentially to take your opponents and to pack them into a district as tightly as you can, and then take the rest of the districts and make sure that they are divided in such a way that your supporters have enough of a majority that you're always going to win, but not too much more. You don't want your people packed together. You want them spread out. So what that means is that your opponents are going to be packed into a very small area and always win in a very small area. In one or two districts, while your people are going to be spread out in a much further, and you'll end up winning more seats even though you have fewer people. The history behind this is it's been done since the early republic. It happened, the reason it's called gerrymandering is the first place to do it, at least in such a way that it was recognized, was the Massachusetts legislature, which did so under a governor named Elbridge Gerry. It's spelled the same but pronounced differently because English, right? So under Elbridge Gerry, they divided the state of Massachusetts so that their candidates would win. Gerry did not like it, but he felt he had to sign it. He didn't have the constitutional right to decline it, and that's why we call it gerrymandering, which is really kind of unfortunate because he shouldn't have to live with something that he hated so much. By the way, any Boston people, the road that runs in front of the Mount Auburn Hospital and BB&N is right there along the Charles River, or right before you get to the Charles River, is called Gary's Landing, and that's Elbridge Gerry. That must have been his land. It's known as Elbridge Gerry. All right, so another tidbit about Elbridge Gerry, he did sign the Declaration of Independence. He later went on to become a vice president for James Madison, and he died in office, and he was buried in Washington, D.C. Trivia here, he is the only signer of the Declaration of Independence buried in Washington, D.C. All right, so it's always been done, so who cares? The Democrats have done it, the Republicans have done it. They've been doing it since a declaration signer was running around. Why do we care now? We care because of computer modeling. Computer modeling means that you can gerrymander with, as one court has said, surgical precision. And that's precisely what has happened in Wisconsin, and I'll explain that in a minute. You also need to know, to understand districting, understand gerrymandering, you have to understand that state districts are drawn by state legislatures. And they are drawn by state legislatures every 10 years according to the census. If you remember, in the US Constitution, the federal government collects a census every 10 years. And by the way, the census is so enormously valuable for historians. I get very upset when people are like, oh, they're invading my business. No, that's how we know how many horses there were in America in the 1890s. Actually, not the 1890s, that census is bad, but in the 1880s. And that's how we know, how much money people made. And that's how, it's like a snapshot of America. So that snapshot of America taken every 10 years goes back to the state legislatures, and they divide up the state into districts for voting for the next 10 years. So the reason that Wisconsin is in such a mess right now is because before the 2010 election, knowing full well that the census of 2010 was going to matter hugely for the next decade, a group of Republican operatives created an organization called REDMAP, and it stood for Republican REDMAP, Republican Redistricting Majority Project. And the idea was, rather than screwing around with fighting about presidential elections or trying to control each congressional election, what they did is they went to donors and they said, let's just win the state legislatures in 2010, because then we can redistrict in such a way that we're going to control these states for the next 10 years. And they did, and they won really dramatically in a number of states that then they redistricted in such a way that the Democrats really have been on the ropes ever since. And Wisconsin is kind of the poster child for what happened, because when they redistricted the state in 2011, as you know, I think I wrote about this last night. In the 2012 election, the Democrats won about 48.8% of the vote in that election, and nonetheless, the Republicans got 60% of the seats in the Wisconsin Assembly. So even though they lost a majority, they got 60% of the seats. And this, of course, the Democrats weren't taking this lying down, so they took it to the Supreme Court. First, they took it to a federal court, saying, our votes aren't equally protected as they should be, and a federal court looked at this and they agreed. By a vote of 2-1, they said, you're right, everybody gerrymanders, but this sucker's off the charts. By the way, I paraphrase, the federal court did not say this sucker's off the charts. But key to that argument that the Republicans in Wisconsin had overreached was the fact that political scientists had found a way to measure just how extraordinarily something was gerrymandered. Because in the past, who was to say what was fair and what wasn't? Because it was kind of done by the seat of your pants on the back of envelopes and in the gut sense. And there was really no way to say, yeah, this is fair, but this one isn't. Unless there was some really obvious metric like race, which is what the kind of metrics that were used with the Voting Rights Act of 65. And you couldn't do it for political affiliation. I mean, who's to say what's fair and what's not? Well, what matters, this mattered because in this case, political scientists have worked very hard on this, and they have come up with a formula to be able to say, listen, in a perfect world, district would be 50% one party, 50% another. But we don't have a perfect world, and we don't have just two parties. So the way we can take a look at whether or not something's fair is what they called the efficiency gap. And what that meant is, where are you within the realm of, yeah, either party could win? And what they came up with was the idea that you needed a gap of 7%, and that a maximum of 7%. I mean, obviously, the lower the number, the better. And they could look at what had happened in Wisconsin and see that anything over 7% they considered was extreme. And what had happened in Wisconsin was over 10. So they took this to the courts and they said, here, you said you needed a formula. We've got a formula. Here you go. So after that went to the federal courts, it gets challenged, the Republicans challenge it, and it goes up to the Supreme Court. And a lot of people had a lot of hope that the Supreme Court would say, yeah, you wanted a formula for what was extreme gerrymandering, here's your formula. But instead, the Supreme Court kind of punted. And in 2019, in the Gill v. Whitford case, it said, the people who sued over this didn't have standing, so we're not going to touch it. This has to go back to the states. When that happened, the gerrymandering persisted in Wisconsin, and in the 2018 election, the Democratic share of the vote went up. It went up to 54% in Wisconsin. Nonetheless, the Republicans kept a majority of 63 seats. So, or 63-seat majority, not a majority of 63 seats, a 63-seat majority. So that's what's up with gerrymandering, and here's why we care. Why are they doing this? I mean, it's not just fun and games, right? Although there is an element of strategy in it for sure. They care because the modern day Republican Party, which is not the traditional Republican Party, they're a very specific subset of what has ever been a Republican Party. Nonetheless, of course, they're in charge of the party now, so yes, it's the Republican Party. But I know a lot of people listen to me who consider themselves Republicans and keep saying, where's my party gone? And you have a reason to think that. This is not the traditional Republican Party. The reason they're doing this is because the goal of this cabal, if you will, that's taken over the party is to get rid of the government that the Democrats and later Eisenhower put in place during the New Deal, World War II, and immediately afterward, that liberal consensus I keep talking about. That's the government we've lived with our whole lives at this point that regulates business, provides a basic social safety net, and promotes infrastructure. That's what we think of as American government. That was new to the 1930s. In the 1920s, business ran government with the idea that it was really businessmen who understood how to run things. And that's the world to which the modern day Republican Party would like to return. You can see this now, especially during this coronavirus crisis, because it has provided the perfect time for the Republican Party with Trump at its head to illustrate what the world would look like if businessmen were in charge. And I think they're doing it really quite deliberately to prove that their system of business rather than bureaucracy, which is the argument against the New Deal government, and the fact it costs tax dollars and is socialism, it redistributes wealth in that Reconstruction formula. You can see that in things like Trump refusing to issue any kind of a national stay-at-home order, saying it's up to the states, and dramatically with Jared Kushner being in charge of coordinating a coronavirus task force with business. And you've probably seen articles about that in the New York Times and the Washington Post and Politico, and Jared Kushner coming out and talking about the National Strategic Stockpile the other day and saying, you know, this is not our job, this is the state's job to take care of. And he's been running his own coronavirus task force in the White House, overriding the other ones that are run, for example, by Mike Pence, saying we really need to have business in charge of this. Just a little bit of about this and how this played out. One of the things that has really shocked me about this whole, and not shocked me, there's a number of things that have shocked me, but what has really kind of bothers me like stay up until 4 o'clock in the morning bothers me, is I can't figure out what a lot of what's happening. You know, I know you guys all sit there and say, oh, she must know all this stuff. I spend hours searching stuff down, but I know where to look. So almost always I can find out what's happening, almost always. The times that I've not been able to are, for example, a couple of years ago when I wrote a piece on the Fox News channel. That was very, very difficult to chase down. And what's bothering me right now is two things. What did Jared Kushner mean when he said the stockpile did not belong to the states? It's our stockpile. And I'm going to read you something about that. And second, what on earth is happening to all the masks and PPEs, personal protective equipment, that's been coming to the country? Where's it going? So let me talk you through a little bit about that. The stockpile is a really interesting question, and I think it symbolizes that the question of, are we a nation of states, 50 states, as we were under the Articles of Confederation, or should we have a federal government? And this conversation between Jared Kushner and reporters, and later between Trump and reporters, confuses me to no end. I literally sit at the computer going, I don't understand. So listen to what happened. Jared Kushner said to a reporter, and this is a quote, "The notion of the federal stockpile is that it's supposed to be our stockpile. It's not supposed to be state stockpiles that they then use." I don't understand what "our" means there. A reporter then later on asked Trump what that meant, and Trump said that was a gotcha question. And he said, quote, "You know what ours means? The United States of America. That's what it means." And the reporter said, "So it means the states." Our, I'm sorry, this is Trump again. Our. It means the United States of America. And then we take that, our, and distribute it to the states. The reporter did not stop, more power to her. She said, then why did he, Kushner, say it's not supposed to be state stockpiles that they then, Trump interrupts, because we need it for the government and we need it for the federal government. I don't know what that means. I mean, I know what that means, but what does it, who is the federal government in this scenario? And then he says, I'm sorry, the reporter says, who are you giving it to if it's not to the states? And he says, quote, "To keep for our country because the federal government needs it too, not just the states." When he, Kushner, says our, he's talking about our country. He's talking about the federal government. And then he says, I mean, it's such a basic, simple question, and you try to make it sound so bad, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. And then he went on to say she had, quote, asked her question in a very nasty tone. I have no idea what they are talking about when they say it is ours versus the states, because here is the history of the Strategic National Stockpile. The National Stockpile, when Kushner initially was talking, said that the stockpile was for use when, quote, local supplies run out, unquote, and, quote, when state, local, tribal, and territorial responders request federal assistance to support their response efforts. As soon as Kushner spoke, as you probably know, the website changed. It said the Strategic National Stockpile's role is to supplement state and local supplies during public health emergencies, and went on to say, quote, many states have products stockpiled as well. Okay, so the history behind the stockpile is fascinating. It actually starts in 1998 when Bill Clinton reads an apocalyptic novel called The Cobra Event by a writer named Richard Preston, in which it's about a pandemic. A mad scientist starts a pandemic in New York City, and Clinton's very worried about bioterrorism, and he knows that the military has stockpiles of drugs and medical supplies for military people, but not for civilians. So he goes and meets with people from the Department of Defense and from the Department of Health and Human Services, and he says, do we have this? And they say, no, we don't. So they set up stockpiles for drugs and vaccines under the CDC for civilians. Congress is behind it, and later on it expands it. So in 2003, they renamed this stockpile the Strategic National Stockpile, and it's overseen by the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Health and Human Services. In 2005, George W. Bush looks at all this and says, we also need masks. So instead of just doing drugs, they're going to be stockpiling masks and personal protective equipment, PPEs. And Congress does it. 2006, it funds PPEs and 52 million surgical masks and 104 N95 air filtration masks. And then those get used up under the Obama administration. Obama does not replace them. I mean, it's for the hurricanes and for H1N1. And he doesn't replace them because he has budget issues with Congress, and they don't fund it enough. They don't fund the National Strategic Stockpile enough that he can put all the money into it. So what he does is he chooses to spend the money on drugs that are being developed by bioterrorism labs because he's afraid they're going to go under, and he figures that we can always get masks on the open market. So the stockpile begins to dwindle under Obama, and then of course Trump doesn't really pay any attention to pandemics at all, so it never gets rebuilt. Now though, the states don't have the stockpile to draw on, and they are bidding against each other, driving up prices, and it's not clear, as I say, to me at all what's going on, but it looks like, and there's both Talking Points Memo and Politico are digging into this, it looks like what's happening is that states are contracting with foreign governments for the purchase of masks and PPEs, and they're getting confiscated when they come to America and being given to private distributors to go ahead and distribute them, at which point the states are bidding against them again and driving prices up. And it's not, don't write that down in stone because it's still incredibly unclear, but one lobbyist quit, or a Republican operative quit his job and said he's just going to be handling PPEs from now on because he has so many of them to sell. And people said, how on earth do you have them to sell? He goes, yeah, I just know people. And that's probably not a very good thing. Now, I hope that's all wrong. Like I say, I really have no idea of the facts behind this. That's where they stand right now. But it keeps coming back to me that I would sure like to know what Jared Kushner meant when he said our that day. And I just do not know. All right. You've also asked about Trump's unhinged press conferences and why the press covers them the way they do. The press has a terrible problem, and it's built into our system since the late 19th century. We had always had a partisan press in this country because the only way that newspapers could afford to print was to take advertisements, and those usually were advertisements that favored one party or the other, and by having contracts to print legislative bills, for example. That's how newspapers stayed in business. So we had a partisan press in this country until the late 19th century, when people get really kind of fed up with that, and there's far more money to put into advertising and to put into newspapers from the new middle class and leisure class, and we get the rise of an independent press. The problem with that independent press, though, is that it's supposed simply, philosophically, to present the news and let people decide what they think about it. That works so long as people are operating in good faith. But after 1950, with the rise of Senator Joe McCarthy from Wisconsin, you get people who are deliberately using that press coverage to grab headlines and to spread lies. And no one knows what to do about McCarthy. The journalists sit and talk about it, and they say, what do we do? You know, a senator accusing a president of being a communist is news. We have to cover it. And in fact, one newspaper tried not to cover it. They tried to put it on page 4, and their readers went ballistic, so they had to move it back up again. It's news, but it's lies. What do we do? And they were able to not to deal with that because McCarthy ends up falling apart in 1954, and there comes a period from the 1955 to about 1978 where there is much more of an attempt not to manipulate the news. With Nixon, of course, the attempt to manipulate the press and to manipulate what people are hearing becomes much more prevalent again. And it takes off under Ronald Reagan. And then finally, with in 1987, with the end of the Fairness Doctrine, the rule that had been in place since the early 20th century, the idea that if you are going to be broadcast news, you need to present the facts fairly. That's destroyed in 1987. And with the end of the Fairness Doctrine, we get the rise of talk radio and the extraordinary use of narrative in politics and false narrative in politics. And journalists, again, were accused repeatedly by people on the right of not being, say, fair and balanced, the way the Fox News Channel claimed to be, because they were fact-checking the people on the right. And in an attempt to be even-handed, as their philosophy said they should be, the media tended to give way too much time to lies, basically, to people who weren't telling the truth. What's happening now with the pressers is the media is finding itself once again in the same problem it did under Joe McCarthy. The president talking about a global pandemic is news. The president lying is news. The president performing in front of people is news. But what do you do when what he's saying could literally kill people? And you can see them grappling with it now. On occasion, different news channels have decided not to carry him. They are trying to fact check him. They've talked about putting him on a 5-minute lag so that they can fact check him in real time. This is something that it would not be a bad idea to write to your news people and say, I don't want to hear this. You know, you're just spreading false information. The problem, of course, is that it does get hits, and news channels need hits because their money is drying up, as you can see by newspapers cutting around the country. All right, I'm sorry, I'm going to take a little bit of a shot over here. I've got one more question I wanted to get to. Somebody asked, how on earth Kushner is doing this? Kushner has never held an elective office. His only qualification is that he is married to the president's daughter. He was, you may remember, denied a security clearance when Trump first got into office. And Trump, because he's president, can overrule those classifications. That's why he has a security clearance. How can he do it? He shouldn't be able to under nepotism laws. But those are so far gone by the wayside. I'm as gobsmacked as you all are about it. There are laws against this, by the way. There is an argument for, there are laws against this, but it is what it is. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say it that way. I'm not accepting of it, but I can't really take this on now and get to where I wanted to be, which was hopeful, because I like to end these with the acknowledgement that Americans have been through a heck of a lot of stuff before. So, you know, people are very unhappy about where we are right now, and how hopeless they feel about what's going on in Wisconsin and about what's going on in Washington. And, you know, in 1862, things weren't looking real great either. And in 1918 or in 1919 when the country is torn apart by race riots, or for African Americans, like, I'm sorry, most of the period from 1876 through maybe the present. World War II wasn't such a great moment either, nor was 68, when there were tanks in the streets and snipers on the buildings of Detroit, for example. So we have lived through a period of great calm in American history for, much of the time really since the 1970s, since the release of the hostages, with the exception of 9/11. And one of the things that, of course, has contributed to that is our refusal, or the government's refusal, to permit media coverage of the fact we are at war in the longest war in American history. I like to remind people of the fact that we've been at war for more than 18 years, and our servicemen and women are fighting now in wars that started before they were born, or virtually before they were born, and that's something we should never forget. But all that to be said, we do and have in the past survived these things. And the question is, have we ever lived through anything that looks like now, like what's happening in Wisconsin and what's happening in the country, where it seems that this radical cabal that is now controlling the formerly grand old party, the formerly great Republican Party, seemingly has taken over Congress, the White House, and the courts. Have we ever seen anything like this before? And the answer is, yeah. We have seen it before. We saw it in the 1850s when the Democrats did something very similar, and we saw it in the 1890s when Republicans did the same. In those periods that had initially been characterized by times of largely equality, with the exception of the 1850s, of course, when we still have human enslavement, but with the idea of the Declaration of Independence being what drives our country. And with that period starting, and this idea, the tremendous economic growth, certain people start to get more money than other people. And pretty quickly, they begin to start to argue that they're really better than everybody else, that they're the ones who should run society. And they start to take over the media and the churches and the literature. And all of those things start to say, we have some really good, smart men in all those periods in our country, and they're really kind of what we aspire to, but they're really kind of better than the rest of us. And gradually they take over a political party, the Democratic Party in the 1850s, the Republican Party in the 1890s, and the Republican Party in the 1990s. They take over a political party and they start to push legislation that further concentrates wealth into their own hands. The large slaveholders in the 1850s, the robber barons in the 1890s, and the American oligarchs of today. As they do so, they get more and more and more money. The wealth rises. People talk about the redistribution of wealth in America. It's redistributed dramatically since 1981 in America. It's gone upward. A very small percentage of Americans have gotten the majority of our increased prosperity since 1981. As they do so, they attack their opponents as being socialists, as wanting to redistribute wealth, and they start to disfranchise other people. The more people they disfranchise, the more they realize that they're in real trouble, because their legislation is hurting more and more and more people. So what do? They entrench themselves in the Supreme Court, and this has happened in each one of those eras. We get the Dred Scott decision in 1857, in which the Supreme Court says Congress cannot stop the spread of human enslavement across the West, which will give elite slave owners control of Congress for all time, thereby making slavery national. In the 1890s, of course, we get Plessy v. Ferguson to follow on that. But we also get Pollock v. Farmers Loan Company, for example, which says that the government can't actually tax anybody, that it has no power to tax. We also get the Insular cases, which brings on Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines. At the time, it's going to become independent in the 1940s. All those island nations, with the idea that they are domestic, but in a foreign sense. That is, they are the land belongs to America, the territories, the unincorporated territories belong to America, but they are not really Americans. And the people who live there are not citizens, they are non-citizen nationals. Again, ways to bring in valuable land without actually offering citizenship to the people there. I say all these things because the present looks very much like that. You see the exact same pattern happening here in the present. And now in the Supreme Court, we see, for example, Citizens United, which gives people, which gives unlimited access to the political process for corporations, and Shelby v. Holder, which, as I say, gutted the Civil Rights Act. And then last night, this spur-of-the-moment decision to say that the election could not be postponed despite the fact we have a global pandemic. So why am I optimistic? Well, I'm optimistic in the long term, not in the tomorrow term. I'm optimistic because I believe in human self-determination. I believe that Americans care about that. I believe that people care about that. But traditionally, Americans have had a system that permits that to wake up and take back over when our democracy is threatened. It always has. It did in the 1850s, it did in the 1890s, it did in the 1930s, and I believe it will do so again. All of you who are so upset about what's happening in Wisconsin, I look at that and I say, my whole career has been spent watching this happen. I have spent hours and hours and hours in libraries watching this group of people in the Republican Party consolidating their power, and no one listened. It's been there all along. As I lay out these things, these dates, I lived through these. I saw this happening and no one paid any attention. So why am I optimistic now? Because you guys are all upset. You're paying attention now. People are paying attention all over the country. And when that happens, it's not that Ted Cruz is suddenly going to listen to you, I promise. And it's not that Donald Trump is going to listen to you. The people who are going to listen to you are the younger, newer politicians rising who need a constituency. And they will know that they can't work their way into this Republican Party, or maybe they won't want to. And they will say, where can I get support? I can get support from people who care about democracy. And they will start to speak for you. So how do you affect that? You make your voices heard. You talk. You write to letters to the editor. You talk on Facebook. You spread your message. You vote for people. You support people. You write postcards. You send money to rising politicians you care about. That's how this changes. Will this be the time that it fails and America becomes a fully fascist state? Maybe. I don't know the future. But the past has said that it won't. And that's why I can look at my computer at 4 o'clock in the morning, so tired I am ready to collapse, and say, this is worth writing about because people need to know about it, because if they do, they're going to do the right thing. I hope this was helpful. If anybody's interested, I will see you on Thursday to continue to talk through history according to the lines of my new book that just came out last week, How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America. And otherwise, I will see you in the letters on Facebook and next week when I try and answer some more questions. Thank you very much.